On Friday, May 8, 2026, Donald Trump announced something that made the entire world stop. Russia and Ukraine had agreed to a ceasefire, a 3-day pause in the war, May 9th through May 11th, brokered by the United States, announced personally by the American president. Trump said he hoped it would be extended. European leaders expressed cautious optimism. Diplomats in Washington, Brussels, and Kyiv used words like momentum and progress. And then, before the weekend was even over, both sides were bombing each other. Again. Russia said it had strictly observed the ceasefire and accused Ukraine of launching 57 drone attacks during the pause. Ukraine reported more than 200 battlefield clashes during the same period. 3 Ukrainian civilians were killed by Russian drone strikes while the ceasefire was supposed to be in force. The ceasefire expired on Monday, May 11th. And what followed was not a careful diplomatic conversation about what went wrong. Russia launched its biggest missile and drone barrage against Ukraine since the full-scale invasion began. One cruise missile destroyed a 9-story apartment building in Kyiv. 24 people were killed. 3 of them were children. Ukraine responded by sending over 1,000 drones to Moscow in a single night, the largest drone attack on the Russian capital in the history of the war. Welcome to the Intel Room. Tonight we are going to break down the most important and most misunderstood dynamic in the Russia-Ukraine war right now. Not the battlefield numbers, not the casualty counts, not the military maps. The gap, the specific, measurable, documented gap between what is being said in diplomatic meetings about ending this war and what is actually happening on the ground every single day. Because that gap is not shrinking. It is growing. And understanding why it exists and why every ceasefire announced in this war has failed before it had a chance to hold is the most important thing anyone following this conflict needs to understand right now. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now. How many ceasefire announcements in the Russia-Ukraine war have you heard since 2022 that actually stopped the fighting for more than a few hours? Because the Intel Room is going to count them tonight, and the number tells you everything. Let us start with what Trump actually announced on May 8th. Because the details of that announcement, the specific language, the specific conditions, the specific promises, reveal exactly why what followed was predictable. Russia and Ukraine confirmed on Friday that they had agreed to a U.S.-brokered 3-day ceasefire that would run from May 9th to May 11th. Trump said he hoped it would be extended. His announcement on Truth Social also said each country would exchange 1,000 prisoners of war each. Easemate AI 1,000 prisoners from each side. The biggest prisoner of war exchange since Russia launched its full-scale invasion in February 2022. That number matters because it is the only concrete, measurable outcome that every ceasefire announcement in this war has reliably produced. Not peace, not reduced violence, not diplomatic progress toward a final settlement. Prisoner exchanges. This is not cynicism. It is the documented pattern of every ceasefire attempt in this conflict since 2022. The fighting pauses briefly. The international community announces progress. Both sides accuse each other of violations. The ceasefire expires. The war resumes. And the only thing that transfers between the two sides is people. Soldiers who have been held captive, traded like currency, in the only transaction both governments reliably complete. The diplomatic language surrounding these moments is always hopeful. Trump saying he hoped for an extension. European leaders expressing cautious optimism. American envoys speaking carefully about momentum. The military reality is always the same. The bombs keep falling. Let us walk through exactly what happened during the 3-day ceasefire. Because the timeline, hour by hour, tells the story more clearly than any political statement. A U.S.-mediated ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine appeared under serious strain on Sunday, with both sides trading blame for weekend attacks. 3 people were killed in Russian drone strikes on areas near the front line, and more than 200 battlefield clashes had taken place since early Saturday, Ukrainian officials reported. Nano banana. More than 200 battlefield clashes during a ceasefire in 48 hours. Russia's defense ministry insisted the military had strictly observed the ceasefire and accused Ukraine of repeatedly violating the agreement. Similar ceasefires announced since Russia invaded its neighbor more than 4 years ago have also failed to stop the fighting. YouTube, both sides saying they observed the ceasefire, both sides saying the other violated it, both sides pointing at the same body of violence and drawing opposite conclusions about who caused it. This is not a new dynamic. This is the defining feature of every ceasefire attempt in this war. The Russian Ministry of Defense announced a ceasefire from May 8th to 9th in a post saying, "We hope that the Ukrainian side will follow suit." Ukraine's President Zelensky said shortly afterwards that he had received no official notice from Russia and that Ukraine would observe a separate ceasefire beginning at midnight on Tuesday, May 5th. Pixelix, read that again. Russia announced a ceasefire for May 8th to 9th. Ukraine announced its own separate ceasefire starting May 5th. Each side announced its own ceasefire on its own timeline without coordinating with the other. Then Trump announced a U.S.-brokered ceasefire for May 9th to 11th, which technically overlapped with what Russia had already declared. 3 separate ceasefire announcements in the same week, covering overlapping time periods, without a single shared framework for what constituted a violation, what counted as a battlefield clash, or who would be monitoring compliance. This is not a ceasefire. This is 3 separate governments announcing peace to their own domestic audiences while the war continues on its own terms. Tell me in the comments, at what point does a ceasefire announcement that both sides immediately accuse the other of violating stop being a diplomatic tool and start being a public relations exercise? Because the intel room is going to be very direct about what that point looks like tonight. Now let us talk about what happened when the ceasefire ended. A U.S.-brokered ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine was due to expire Monday, with both sides accusing each other of breaching the 72-hour arrangement, as American and European officials considered how they might steer the warring countries into further talks. Product hunt. The ceasefire expired. The question was, what came next? The answer came almost immediately. Russia launched what Ukrainian officials described as the largest aerial bombardment since the full-scale invasion began. Dozens of cruise missiles, hundreds of drones, all aimed at Ukraine, particularly at Kyiv. One cruise missile found a 9-story apartment building in the Darnitsky district of the Ukrainian capital at 3 in the morning while families were sleeping. The building partially collapsed. 24 people were recovered from the rubble. 3 of them were children. Zelensky analyzed the wreckage of the specific missile that hit the apartment building and found something that should alarm every government that has imposed sanctions on Russia to prevent exactly this outcome. The missile was manufactured in the second quarter of 2026. While the ceasefire was being negotiated, while peace talks were being discussed in diplomatic meetings, Russia was building new missiles while talking about peace. And Ukraine's response, which came within days, was to launch over 1,000 drones at Moscow in a single overnight operation. The largest drone assault on the Russian capital in the history of the conflict. 4 people were killed in the Moscow region. An oil refinery was set on fire. Hundreds of flights were canceled at Russia's largest airports. Debris fell on the grounds of Sheremetyevo Airport. And Russia, which had been bombing Ukrainian apartment buildings while ceasefire talks were ongoing, banned its own media from photographing the damage. The ceasefire lasted 3 days. What followed it was the most intense exchange of aerial attacks this war has seen. Now let us look at the peace talks themselves, because this is where the gap between the diplomatic language and the battlefield reality becomes impossible to ignore. The most recent direct talks between Russian and Ukrainian negotiators took place in Istanbul. They lasted less than 2 hours. The only concrete outcome was an agreement to exchange 1,000 prisoners of war from each side. No ceasefire was agreed. No framework for future negotiations was established. No leader-level meeting was scheduled. 2 hours, after 4 years of war. And the only thing that came out of the room was a list of names. The positions of both sides in those talks explain why. Russia's conditions for ending the war remain unchanged. Putin has demanded the full withdrawal of Ukrainian forces from the illegally claimed Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia oblasts, along with guarantees that Ukraine would not join NATO and would remain a neutral, non-nuclear state. Pixel cut. Let us be specific about what this demand means in practice. Russia is demanding that Ukraine withdraw from 4 regions that Russia has claimed as its own territory since 2022, but that Russia does not even fully control militarily. Russia controls approximately 50 to 80% of each of those regions. It is demanding that Ukraine surrender the parts of those regions that Ukraine is currently defending and hand over the territory to a country that invaded it without provocation. This is not a negotiating position. It is a demand for the other side to accept the terms of its own defeat. Putin said he is ready to meet Zelensky in Moscow at any moment. He added the key is that there must be a reason to meet, that the meeting serves a purpose, and crucially, that it be productive. Pixlr, ready to meet at any moment, provided the meeting serves a purpose, provided it is productive. But what does productive mean to Vladimir Putin? It means Ukraine accepting Russia's territorial demands before sitting down. It means the outcome of the meeting being predetermined before the participants enter the room. Zelensky's position is equally clear and equally inflexible. He wants a ceasefire before any leader-level summit. He says if he meets Putin without a ceasefire first and no agreement is reached, the ceasefire would end that same day. He wants the United States present at any leader-level meeting as a guarantor of the process. And he has consistently refused to accept any peace deal that formally surrenders Ukrainian territory to Russian control. Both leaders saying they are ready for talks. Both leaders describing talks that the other cannot accept. That is not a peace process. That is a performance of a peace process. The contradictions inside the Russian government are revealing in ways that the Kremlin does not intend. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said peace in Ukraine is a very long way away, while President Vladimir Putin suggested the war was coming to an end. Nano banana. The Kremlin's own spokesman and the Russian president gave contradictory assessments of how close the war was to ending, in the same news cycle, on the same day. Peskov says, very long way away. Putin says, coming to an end. Which one is describing Russia's actual strategic position? Which one is being deployed for which audience? Peskov's very long way away is directed at the Russian domestic audience, preparing Russian citizens psychologically for a prolonged conflict that will continue to require their sacrifice, their sons, their resources, their acceptance of economic hardship. Putin's coming to an end is directed at the international audience, at Trump, at European leaders, at the Gulf states trying to mediate, at everyone who needs to believe that diplomacy is producing results in order to maintain the political will to keep engaging rather than walking away. Both statements can be simultaneously useful to the Kremlin. Both can be simultaneously true depending on which timeline you are measuring against. And neither one tells you anything about when the bombs will stop falling, because the bombs have not stopped falling. Not during the ceasefire, not during the peace talks, not during the diplomatic momentum, not during the hopeful language from Washington. 24 people in Kyiv are dead. 3 of them were children born in 2008, 2010, and 2013. Russia's Kremlin spokesman says peace is a very long way away. Putin says the war is coming to an end. And the missile that killed those 3 children was manufactured in the second quarter of 2026, while both of those statements were being made. Tell me in the comments, which statement do you believe? Peskov's very long way away or Putin's coming to an end? Because the answer you give tells you how you read everything that happens next in this war. Here is the dimension of this story that the intel room wants to examine most carefully, because it explains the pattern that every observer of this conflict has noticed, but that very few have articulated clearly enough. Why does every ceasefire in this war fail? Not this ceasefire, not just the May 9th to 11th ceasefire, every ceasefire. The Easter ceasefire in April 2025 that Russia declared and Ukraine called a PR stunt. Zelensky reported 3,000 Russian violations during a 30-hour pause. Russia accused Ukraine of using American weapons during the truce. The Easter ceasefire in April 2026. Ukraine and Russia agreed to a 32-hour pause. Fighting continued, both sides accused the other of multiple violations. The ceasefire ended with both sides reporting zero progress toward anything beyond the specific pause period. The competing ceasefires of May 5th and May 8th that neither side actually coordinated with the other. The U.S. brokered May 9th to 11th ceasefire that expired with both sides accusing each other of 200-plus violations. And after each one, more bombing, more casualties, more destroyed cities, more children in rubble. The reason every ceasefire fails is not primarily military, it is structural. For a ceasefire to hold, both sides must believe that stopping the fighting serves their strategic interests better than continuing it. Not temporarily, not for the duration of a prisoner exchange, but genuinely and durably. Russia does not believe that, not while it continues to advance, however slowly, on the battlefield. Not while it can continue to drain Ukraine's manpower and resources through artillery and missile exchanges. Not while time appears to be on its side economically and demographically. Not while the political cost of a ceasefire that does not deliver the territorial gains it has promised its own population is higher than the political cost of continuing. Ukraine does not fully believe that either. Not while it is actively retaking territory for the first time in over a year. Not while its drone campaign is demonstrating new capabilities that are shifting the military balance. Not while accepting a ceasefire under current conditions would mean accepting a frozen conflict that leaves Russia in control of 20% of Ukrainian land, including the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is Europe's largest nuclear facility and which remains under Russian occupation, and which control has been identified as a major sticking point in the current talks. Both sides have genuine reasons to keep fighting. Both sides have genuine costs from doing so, and the point at which the cost of fighting exceeds the cost of the concessions required to stop it, that point has not yet been reached by either side. That is why every ceasefire fails. Not because the diplomats are incompetent, not because Trump's envoys are doing something wrong, not because the mediators, Pakistan on Iran, Turkey and the US on Ukraine, have failed to find the right formula, but because neither Vladimir Putin nor Volodymyr Zelensky has decided that the formula for peace is worth more to them than the war they are still fighting. Where does this leave the immediate situation? U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner will visit Moscow soon enough to continue talks with Russia, Kremlin advisor Yuri Ushakov told reporters. Nano Banana Witkoff and Kushner heading to Moscow. The same Steve Witkoff who has been trying to broker a deal between Russia and Ukraine for months. The same Jared Kushner whose involvement in Middle East diplomacy during Trump's first term produced the Abraham Accords, a genuine diplomatic achievement that changed regional relationships. They are going to Moscow. They will sit across from Russian officials. They will discuss frameworks and parameters and conditions and timelines. And while those conversations are happening, the Ukrainian front line will continue to be contested. Russian drones will continue to target Ukrainian cities. Ukrainian drones will continue to target Russian oil infrastructure, military facilities, and strategic assets hundreds of kilometers inside Russian territory. The diplomacy and the war are not sequential. They are simultaneous. And right now, the war is louder than the diplomacy. There is one more factor that the intel room needs to address directly because it is shaping this entire peace process in ways that the press coverage is not fully capturing. America's attention is divided. The same administration that is trying to broker peace in Ukraine is simultaneously managing a war with Iran, a Strait of Hormuz crisis that has disrupted 20% of global energy trade, a diplomatic crisis over the Barrage nuclear plant attack, a domestic political crisis over the San Diego mosque shooting, and the aftermath of a failed Beijing summit with Xi Jinping. Negotiations to end the war in Ukraine have stalled out as the U.S. shifts focus to waging war against Iran. Pixlr. Stalled out, because Washington is looking southeast at the Persian Gulf rather than northeast at eastern Ukraine. Every hour of American diplomatic bandwidth spent on the Iran ceasefire is an hour not spent on the Ukraine peace process. Every strategic calculation about the Hormuz Strait is a calculation not being made about the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. Every conversation with Gulf state leaders about the next 48 hours is a conversation not happening with Zelensky or with Ushakov. The United States is the only actor with enough leverage over both Russia and Ukraine to produce the conditions for a lasting ceasefire. And right now, the United States is managing more simultaneous crises than any administration in recent memory, with a diplomatic bandwidth that is finite and a public attention that can only absorb so much at once. Here is the honest conclusion that the intel room will not soften. The ceasefire that Trump brokered from May 9th to 11th was not meaningless. The prisoner exchange, 2,000 people returning to their families after captivity, was not meaningless. The diplomatic momentum that produced that conversation was not meaningless. But the bombing did not stop. Russia built new missiles during the peace negotiations and used them to kill children in a Kyiv apartment building on the night the ceasefire expired. Ukraine sent 1,000 drones to Moscow in response. Putin's spokesman says peace is a very long way away. Putin himself says the war is coming to an end. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are going to Moscow, and tomorrow night, as you sleep, the drones will still be flying, the artillery will still be firing, the cities will still be taking damage, and the men and women on both sides of the front line will still be doing the work that no ceasefire announcement has yet been able to stop them from doing. The gap between the diplomatic language and the battlefield reality in this war is not shrinking. It is the defining feature of where this conflict is right now. And until both Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky reach the same conclusion at the same moment, that the cost of continuing exceeds the cost of compromising, no ceasefire will hold. Not this one, not the next one, not the one after that. Every war ends eventually. History has never produced an exception to that rule. The question is not whether this war ends. It is how many more apartment buildings will come down before it does. This is the Intel Room. If this analysis gave you a clearer picture of why peace in Ukraine keeps being announced and keeps failing to arrive, subscribe right now and hit the notification bell. We will be here for every development, every ceasefire, every violation, every missile, and every conversation about a peace that has not yet come. We will be watching.